I have been fortunate to have teachers who were students of Dr. Faulkner's, and they were excellent teachers. They were teachers who cared about their students, were dedicated to their students' success, and I asked them, was Dr. Faulkner that way? And they said, yes, he was. They spoke about him with affection and respect and admiration. They praised him for not only his devoted guidance, but also his good cheer, which is an essential trait in a graduate school professor. And I have, in fact, benefited personally from Dr. Faulkner's guidance, although I don't know that he'll remember it. He chaired a panel I was on at the New England Political Science Association several years ago. Some chairs show up to panels without having read the papers. Some chairs don't show up at all. Dr. Faulkner not only showed up, but also had read each of the papers thoroughly. He gave a thoughtful introduction that brought together the various topics and had penetrating questions about each of them. Unable to answer those questions adequately, I spent the time revising the paper significantly, and thanks in large part to his criticisms and questions, was able to improve it sufficiently to get it published. I'm not sure that at the time I was particularly grateful, but I am now. In addition to his teaching, Dr. Faulkner is a highly regarded scholar, and his work ranges impressively across the history of political thought, from Xenophon and Aristotle to Machiavelli, Locke and Bacon, to Lincoln, Marshall, and of course, Alexis de Tocqueville. And what I find especially noteworthy about his work is the way that he brings the history of political thought to bear on contemporary problems in political life. His wonderful book, Honorable Ambition, The Case for Greatness, is one that I have used with students in my first-year seminar, and I wish that my students from this year, who spent an entire semester reading Tocqueville's Democracy in America, could be here today to benefit from his wisdom. They are not, but we are, and so I ask you to join me in welcoming Dr. Robert Faulkner.
I've never before been compared to the effects that lead us to believe in God. And I thank Kevin Cherry for a very nice introduction. I'm going to read my paper because I can be more exact and precise in doing that. And I have a lot to say. It's longer than I'd like. Those of you who need to get coffee, depart out of boredom, whatever, should feel free to do this. Let me say it's a pleasure and an honor to be back for discussions at the Jepson School. A number of us are meeting tomorrow in seminars to talk about this topic, and I want to say that for them, I regard this as a kind of introduction to our discussions to come. Tocqueville's masterwork teaches us about greatness in a democracy like ours, and in particularly in ours. Of course, these things have changed in nearly 2 centuries, but the problem remains, and Tocqueville's perceptiveness may illuminate the scope and significance of the changes. I do think that's the case. For my fellow panelists in the next couple of days, I ask them to come with questions of their own, because I'm not, contrary to the impression that Professor Cherry left, I'm no great scholar of Tocqueville. This was, for me, a learning experience going through him, and I expect to learn more. Our new President Trump would make America great again. But what is this greatness? The inaugural address was blunt. America will be again strong, wealthy, safe, and proud. I suppose we will be proud of being strong, wealthy, and safe. These are good things. But the list seems incomplete. What of the country's obvious and everyday concern with equal rights? With freedom, our style, and constitutional democracy, with popular government, our style? Could we be proud, even if we are not free and not democratic, not caring for individual rights and popular self-government? If we couldn't, then what is the relation between our greatness and our liberal and democratic spirit? That, more or less, was the question governing Tocqueville's life, both as writer and as statesman. Admittedly, this book, Democracy in America, is no spring chicken. The 2 volumes were published in 1835 and 1840 and based upon 9 months of observations in 1831 and 32. Still, this is an old book that remains ever new. Harvey Mansfield, on whose translation I've relied, called it the best book ever on democracy and the best book ever on the United States. Tocqueville thought to know not chiefly America as such, but America as successful exemplar of that growing worldwide phenomenon, modern democracy as such. His great question still applies, despite the dark musing of postmodernists. How did America succeed when his native France and many other attempts in the interim had failed? Succeed at what? Succeed at overcoming, quote, the perils that equality brings to human independence. That's his formulation. Tocqueville's variation, then, is a variation on the liberal problem. Ours is a liberal democracy. Many of us call ourselves conservatives, but we are conserving, in a way, a liberal democracy in a deep sense. How might political rule, in this case the new democratic rule, foster human liberty? In 1848, even years after his masterworks publication, he told his French countrymen, the Americans had the answer. They had, quote, solved the problem, unquote, of retaining liberty beneath the sovereignty of the people. We tend to call ourselves a democracy, and therefore we muddle the complications of being at once liberal and democratic. We're both. We're not simply democratic. We have these courts, we have this president, we have officials which in fact are far from a mere popular crowd, that's for sure. And we believe in equal rights. Nevertheless, however the American Democrats had provided for liberty, Tocqueville doubted until his end whether they provided adequately for greatness. True greatness, he thought, was of self-government, moral and intellectual self-government in each of us, as well as political. Indeed, Tocqueville, in a complicated way, identified liberty with such rational self-guidance. And it is this, he thought, that democracy, that is popular government, tends to undermine. Even in America, he said, democracy breeds pervasive conformity of mind, what he famously calls majority tyranny. Think of our political correctness. And preoccupation with industry and material advancement, with the necessities, luxuries, and riches that constitute what he calls well-being and what we call a good standard of living. This conformity to public opinion, this materialism in public taste, undermined independent and elevated judgment in mind and character alike, he thought, and in literature as well as in citizens and statesmen. In many of Tocqueville's musings, it seems to be old-fashioned aristocracy, aristocratic republics, not modern democrats and democratic republics that fostered strong characters, passionate thinkers, and rational and moral policies. Tocqueville, an astute commentator once said, was in many ways a sad liberal. But in face of these famous doubts, one must confront three contrary aspects of Tocqueville's thinking on democracy. First, the United States partakes of greatness precisely as vehicle, the best vehicle, of the vast and progressive democratic movement. How did the West win those two great world wars and then the Cold War? Second, democracy is not only necessary, given modern equality of conditions, but also more just and preferable. It is more useful to humanity, whereas aristocratic greatness is now obsolete and arbitrary to the point of baselessness. Democracy is not. Third, despite Tocqueville's own tastes, he was an aristocrat. He lived as an aristocrat, but he admired democracy as just. He thinks the United States has managed to tame the democratic beast. It is great enough in its own democratic way. My talk is basically explaining those 3 points. So, first, democracy's greatness. Americans, Tocqueville says, have a magnificent image of themselves. Despite their preoccupations with the prosaic necessities of life and gain, there is, quote, a thought full of poetry that gives vigor to all the rest of their thinking. There's a hidden nerve, and it involves the idea of progress. Democratic idealism attends not to the past, but to the future, not to God, but to man as peopling the solitude and subduing nature, and not to this or that glorious Caesar or beauteous Cleopatra. Instead, the Americans think themselves exemplar of the progress of, quote, humanity, unquote, at large. Anti-poetic and prosaic though the life of this people is, he says, they're poets, as no poets before can make grand images of the future of man on earth. God re-enters only at this point. He is entitled to our appreciation, but only as the hidden planner of a vast movement that exhibits the destiny of the human species. Now, Tocqueville remarks on the bombastic character of much of American poetizing. Nevertheless, this poetizing is cut off in a way, he thinks, from nature, tradition, and outstanding human beings. Nevertheless, he himself goes far in accepting this American self-image of greatness. This is notable in his final chapters. At first, he admits his thoughts went the other way. And we have this kind of picture. The spectacle, it sounds like Nietzsche, the spectacle of this innumerable crowd, where nothing is elevated and nothing lowered, saddens and even, quote, chills him, unquote. He had inclined not to such middling uniformity, but to the outstanding, to the very great, the very rich, the very learned. He says that himself. But he checked himself. He first defers to God, whose comprehensive concern envelops the whole human race, not some class. What seems decadence is therefore progress. Then he urges the principle. Equality is perhaps less elevated, he says, but it is more just, and its justice makes for its greatness and its beauty. Democracy is great and noble in its way. That is, in its justice. Moreover, it is necessary. Democracy is the historical destiny of the human race, and so Tocqueville's famous premises, which in a way help us to understand the movement of which willy-nilly Americans are a part. A great democratic revolution is taking place among us, and its cause is an increasing equality of conditions. This pervasive equalizing of conditions, he says, has been developing for 700 or 800 years, ever since the church opened its priesthood to poor as well as rich. This democratic revolution cannot be halted. It must be accepted, but it also has to be counseled. Tocqueville will tell you at the end of his great book, it's more likely we're going to have new egalitarian despotisms than having a world of free republics. Those of us who have lived through the 20th century, I haven't lived through all of it, all right, but those of us who have lived through the 20th century must grasp that the possibility of new kinds of socialism, despotisms, national and Marxist. It can be counseled. It can be counseled not least by aristocratic friends. Tocqueville is such a friend who retained the old and more elevated inclinations. I think we have a paper here. Pardon me. Such eulogies by Tocqueville could seem but rhetoric, speechifying as he tries to help embittered French aristocrats make the best of a bad situation. but in fact they express Tocqueville's own thinking. Despite his aristocratic heritage and inclinations, democratic equality is not fundamentally a bad situation because it is potentially the just situation, more just than the alternative, aristocratic inequality. If appropriately guided or counseled, it is grand in its own way. Here's an example. There is nothing more admirable or more powerful, he can write, than a great orator discussing great affairs in a democratic assembly. Why? Because such discussions have universal significance. The whole nation is at issue, not merely some class. And indeed, quote, the question of man, who is the same everywhere. Tocqueville's intensity about democracy in this extraordinary book and in his whole life is finally inexplicable unless one grasps the grand significance he perceives in the democratic revolution. It brings a deserved priority to universal humanity and its universal rights. America shows the significance of democracy in this country. It shows lessons in how the future of humanity can work. In our, quote, century, unquote, of equality of conditions, we must seek not old aristocratic greatness, but the greatness proper to democracy. And now, a sober side. Admittedly, this democratic greatness, principled as it seems, also tends to greatness in a familiar sense, the most familiar sense, empire, imperialism. True, Tocqueville criticizes the traditional hunger for imperial rule as such, as well as the dazzle of military glory, so dangerous to republics and, quote, society. But modern democracy's preoccupation with economic gain has its own expansive dynamic, which Tocqueville acknowledges. Insisting on equality, the democratic citizen secretly wants to be distinguished, and he puts his all into his work. American industrialists, Tocqueville says, this is in his observations from the 1830s, and his book's written basically then, the new industrialists will control, quote, vast empires at home. and Americans in that spirit will adventure abroad. Tocqueville is astonished by our merchant marine. Captains on the sea display a sort of heroism as they push from port to port, almost without rest, almost heedless of danger, all to save or get a penny here or there. By their audacity, their industry, they come to gain control of the carrying trade, a limited kind of empire. But commerce calls for protection, and this tends to empire in a fuller sense. With its new sea power, America's flag is respected. Soon, it will be feared. It's in the 1830s. America will control the seas. The American power on the seas, Tocqueville writes, is will be what the old Roman Empire was to the land. Some analog. Actually, the Americans expand on land too. The insidious takeover of Indian hunting grounds is a model of what bordering lands may expect from this new spirit of enterprise. Pioneers will overwhelm the Mexican foothold in Texas, infringe other treaties with the Mexicans, and influence all South America, as he says. Tocqueville's famous prediction, only a similarly vast people, the Russians, will rival the American advance across the continent and over the ocean. In his grand account, Russia and the United States alike are tending to what he calls unity, a vast kind of equality of conditions that's growing, away from medieval fragmentation into castes and classes. But the Americans expand by plowshares and freedom. That is, economic gain and popular government. The Russians by arms and despotism. So closes Tocqueville's Volume 1. Republican and free American democracy seems great in purpose and significance as well as in force, and with a world historical scale and significance. but as to Indians and neighbors, so if we have this basic kind of eulogy, Tocqueville acknowledges that this grand advance of equality will have downsides. If we have this basic eulogy, what do we make of Tocqueville's famous fears as to democracy, even a successful democracy? By the way, can I be heard? As Tom Lehrer says, all right for quantity anyway. Yeah, good.
The microphone closer to your face.
Okay, that better?
Yes.
Good. What to begin with of the mediocrity he finds in public officials and public deliberation? The Washingtons, the Jeffersons, the Madisons of the Revolution have disappeared, only to be succeeded by very ordinary officials, unstable policies, a surfeit of laws, and incompetence in foreign policy. Consider how a Washington would run in the present-day elections. As he puts it, outstanding figures cannot advance without debasing themselves. Is this an advance of humanity? Then there are his deeper and more famous apprehensions, such as, quote, majority tyranny. Popular rule is majority rule, and a mediocre majority enforces a newly thorough conformity to public opinion, that is, their opinion. The result is an everyday timidity, one more servile and less free, Tocqueville says, than that of courtiers and courts in the absolute monarchies of Europe. Quote, I do not know any country where, in general, less independence of mind and genuine freedom of discussion reigns than in America. Civilization has perfected despotism. These disturbing formulations in Volume 1 are followed by worse in the concluding arguments of Volume 2, which finally treats of the institutional kinds of hierarchies, somehow bred by modern equality of conditions, according to his argument. An industrial aristocracy, more mean and narrow than feudalism, exploits an increasingly degraded industrial working class. A centralized and representative service state degrades less by exploiting than by serving. Promising comprehensive care without the pain of self-reliance, it makes for ever more personal weakness and ever more dependence upon a vast administrative state. Some guy, huh? 1830s? But Tocqueville's apprehensions go beyond these dangers to Republican independence in choice and self-government. What is at stake is even the dignity of man, even the nature of man. The fundamental problem is a pervasive materialism. The Democrats' dominant taste distracts from the most precious good that makes the glory and greatness of its species, that is, the intellectual capacities that are the most sublime faculties. The effects are felt every day in busyness and what we call consumer culture, and they are pervasive, extending even to philosophy and things spiritual. I won't go into this at length. He attacks basically the tendency to interpret things in democracies in a material way. A materialistic philosophy, which he calls pantheism, comes to pervade things. Our way of would be putting it, there's always a kind of scientific explanation for things, allegedly, and this is understood as some force, some material force pushing us to things. The question arises, given such dangers, even to mankind's highest faculties, how is it that Tocqueville remains a, quote, liberal, unquote, a partisan of modern democracy, as he remained for his whole life? I'll review 3 reasons which have already been touched. First, the Americans show how democratic individuals can be self-governing citizens, not merely narrowed proletarians, apathetic consumers, and self-interested individuals. Second, the Americans show how religion, rights, and enlightenment elevate the popular outlook. The common man can become somewhat great in his own way. Again, equality is perhaps less elevated, but it is more just, and its justice is its greatness and its beauty. And third, Tocqueville has historical and philosophic doubts about greatness. The time for aristocratic greatness is past. More to the point, Tocqueville seems to have epistemological doubts about even moral greatness, in the traditional sense of moral virtue. Or at least, as I'll argue in a somewhat complicated conclusion, he understands it with a view to a moral freedom that all can somehow share. So now, just greatness, the third topic, the art of being free. This is what Tocqueville, in all his life, tried to develop. An art of being free at a time when equality of conditions presses toward apathy and a kind of even new kinds of despotisms. He couldn't forecast all of them, but new kinds of despotisms. Whatever the occasional pessimism and aristocratic disdain he shows, the dominant tenor of democracy in America is encouraging and therapeutic, not melancholic and fearful. Yes, equality of conditions may lead awry, but the American example, suitably corrected and generalized, suggests a democratic remedy for democracy's fault. A new political science is needed for a world altogether new, and the Americans have the good fortune and also the quality of exemplifying this art of being free. Mediocre public officials, short-sighted and underfunded policies, yes. But these political defects are secondary. For America's is limited government, and it is the private sphere, society itself, that bustles with enterprise, industry, talent, and judgment. Private sphere is my language. His language is society. People are part of society, and society bustles with these things. Society is thus energized, but it is also ordered. And here Tocqueville helps us understand our country remarkably. The society orders us. Individuals arrange themselves to push this local road, that economic invention, this moral improvement. The core of the art of being free is not political science, but what Tocqueville calls the science of association. Society, in a good democracy, almost governs itself. So in this way, political freedom frees the individuals and remedies the ills to which equality of conditions gives rise. Admittedly, now I've overstated the success that Tocqueville sees. Foreign policies remain a problem, given everyday instability and mediocre magistrates. But here again, virile society helps remedy bumbling politics. An underlying social dynamism builds national wealth and power at a prodigious rate. Democracies, while slow off the mark when war begins, will eventually bring vast powers to bear. World War I, World War II. Of course, Tocqueville knew that as to foreign affairs, the Americans were particularly lucky in their geography. No European democracy could get away with the Americans' weak national state, weak executive, and rather incompetent public officials. Still, crises are likely to bring forth talents hitherto hidden in private pursuits. Moreover, social self-governing is not all. Political republicanism can work. For Tocqueville, free government is government by deliberation and choice, and free democratic government is government by widespread deliberation and choice. Tocqueville calls this republicanism, or political freedom. In America, it works. Why? Simply put, the Americans are lucky, and they are good. They were lucky in having a rather free and democratic beginning. They were good in accepting an impressive constitution. Their point of departure, their beginning, encompassed New England's rather Republican religion, that Protestantism of the time. And I want to add, he eventually interpreted Catholicism as also very democratic. And also encompassed in South as well as North the British tradition of free government. Americans, he says, were born equal and republican. But they benefited too from the federal Constitution, so much better than the mere populist, as we would say, or democratic state constitutions. That act of self-regulation was a great Republican feat for a democracy. It was, in fact, the product of the great figures of an aristocratic party, the Federalists. Now, here we have an obvious connection between greatness in the aristocratic sense and America's success at free government and greatness. Tocqueville admires the remarkably prudent statesmen who carried to success the American Revolution. He distinguishes them sharply from the impractical French revolutionaries who began a French Revolution and then brought it down in flames. He doesn't blame the French intellectuals. He blames the French monarchs who deprived the French elites of Republican experience. The American leaders benefited from their Republican history and in turn infused democratic numbers and impulsiveness with prudent self-government and representative institutions, that Constitution. Accordingly, governing came to lie somewhat with moderate men, institutionally guided to moderation, guided especially by a constitutional law and British common law. Tocqueville dwells on the healthy influence of courts, judges, and juries who educate and discipline public participation. He dwells on lawyers with their arcane turn to precedents, who help to insinuate reason and formal procedures almost insidiously as they facilitate private business. All these are fountains of reason and enlightenment. Finally, and not to be slighted, he praises the political and moral work of ministers of God, who help to elevate and spiritualize the public taste. So the political, intellectual part of the art of being free. A question, however, is there not a paradox in this allegation of democracy's rectification of democracy? Is the rectification, in fact, democratic? With the Constitution, the majority, quote, put itself in a way above itself. Is this so-called democratic feat, the Constitution, not the product of the genuinely great figures of aristocracy, of an aristocratic party, of the Federalists? Must liberal democracy to be successful be mixed with non-democratic elements, such as great figures and enlightened moderates? Must it be mixed also with the continuing influence of rigorous Protestant morals and monarchic and aristocratic discipline? Tocqueville holds, for example, that man's true grandeur lies only in the harmony of liberal sentiment with religious sentiment. But he also holds that religion is the most precious inheritance from aristocratic centuries. Does Tocqueville tacitly commend a mixed regime, that is, a mixture of democratic, monarchic, aristocratic, and theocratic elements, as old Aristotle might put it? Aristotle might say yes. Tocqueville says emphatically no. There is no such thing as mixed government, he says. Aristotle was wrong. Why? Aristotle, that old fogey, missed the decisive effect of the democratic social state. To begin with, Aristotle was wrong about democracy. What he called democracy, with women and slaves in the social state of non-citizen, was in fact aristocracy. A minority ruled the majority. Besides, Aristotle had no experience of the historically developing equality of social conditions and the corresponding disappearance, crucial for Tocqueville, of hierarchical social classes. Aristotle was in fact formed by the old aristocratic world. Tocqueville's views, in Tocqueville's view, there are but two such classes, aristocratic and democratic. They cannot mix. They cannot understand one another. They hate one another, and in power they replace one another. It is the developing replacement of aristocracy by equality of conditions that reshaped puritanical republicanism, semi-aristocratic colonial assemblies, and even the founders' outlook as the popular government, the party system. The so-called aristocratic parties, great figures, had themselves become devoted to popular self-government and rather experienced in it. George Washington's formula for what he aimed for in War and Peace was the existence of popular self-government. That's it. Those are his words. In fact, and again, both as general and as a legislator in various senses. But in introducing the new, while in old dress, they were but transitional. When Tocqueville visited 30-odd years after Washington implemented America's constitutional republic, the Federalist Party was completely defunct. How, then, does Tocqueville account for what he nevertheless asserts, the importance for democratic success of elements such as free government, a constitution, and the great figures of the American Revolution and founding? If those are not democratic, how does he account for them by democracy? The reason, again, is history, or his liberal understanding of democratic history. Democracy inherently involves such features as constitutional government and the idea of rights, all proceeding by inherent development. Such orderly development is almost automatic, even natural, so long as the rival classes are not embittered by violent revolutionary clashes. So Tocqueville seems to suppose, and so America's luck in being born equal. I think I'm going to cut a little bit of this. I give examples of his historical kind of, can I put it this way, belief or faith, a belief in history, history's development. Let me just say, Tocqueville does note the influence of certain theories, a theory of the division of labor, which reduces workers to dumb specialists, and a theory of public administration, which exacerbates the centralized modern state. But he never brings up the liberal philosophers' comprehensive theories of the state of nature, individual rights, sovereignty, executive power, and constitutional government. Hobbes and Locke go unmentioned, and although he mentions Montesquieu, he criticizes him. Nevertheless, there can, although traditional political science, which claimed that it could guide things if only people would listen, and he rejects that, there can be an art of being free which he develops. This is Tocqueville's art, which builds upon an actual democracy that befits an actual equality of conditions and that historically incorporates liberal institutions and rights. In some sense, Tocqueville then is a progressive liberal. He believes in the progress of history. Can I put it this way? We've always believed in progress, but the original formulation was that it's something that we have to make. We have to follow science or something like that. For Tocqueville, history is carrying us in a way. Fourth topic. Why the country is not great in his opinion. Quote, why one finds so many ambitious men in the United States and so few great ambitions. One could say that of women also, yes? He has a special understanding of women. He even says that the secret of the American success is in fact the superiority of their women, but I can just tell you that his opinions on women are rejected by feminists, to put it mildly. But does the art of freedom provide adequately against the full extent of the problem? The fundamental danger of democracy is that equal conditions may debase the souls of democratic men. And Tocqueville clearly worries that the danger will overcome corrective measures, whatever they are. His worries, which worries are present in the whole book, but especially in the concluding parts 3 and 4 of Democracy America. While democratic peoples may want freedom and self-government, they want equality more than freedom, and material goods more than rational and spiritual ones. It is this outlook that underlies the mediocre taste, the conformity, the industrial-style production, and the willing subordination to a vast administrative provider. Democracy can make men less independent and rational in politics and mind, not more. Tocqueville's most precise account is 13 chapters at the end of Part 3 that address expressly the problematic relation between democratic equality and human quality. The series begins lightly with a discussion of manners, Democratic manners are neither either well-regulated or well-informed. Aristocratic manners, caste-ridden as they may be, exhibit, quote, a natural loftiness, a natural grandeur of thought that disdains little interest in material cares, while shedding beautiful illusions over human nature. I call your attention to the word illusions. I'll come back to focus on something like that. The series ends gravely with 5 chapters on the special dangers from democratic armies. This is an extraordinary book by a young man in his 20s, which is just remarkable comprehensiveness. There are 5 chapters on armies, on democratic armies, and what we're likely to expect. While soldiers are ambitious for war, thus to promote themselves, their democratic societies are passive in softness and thus anxious for peace. Accordingly, one may expect coups at home, the many revolutions by the colonels in budding democracies, by army men, most likely from NCOs, especially as centralized government increases in power. Abroad, there are dangers from young soldiers eager for war, and alternatively from a democratic society's promotion of people in peacetime by seniority, with the resulting lack of vigor and preparation. This country was so lucky after World War I to have someone like George Catlett Marshall with his little black book of all the able generals, of all the able young people, as opposed to all the fogyish generals, who, in fact. Between these bookends of manners and armies, Tocqueville discusses the boastful vanity of equal citizens needing to distinguish themselves, and the mix of busyness, petty tasks, and boring monotony in democratic daily life. An important chapter, the longest in Volume 2, speaks of the unlikeliness, nevertheless, of great revolutions. An immense middle class will mediate the eternal clash of rich and poor, and that the secret of our country's stability. The 2 discussions most relevant for our topic concern ambition, widespread but rarely great, and honor, which Tocqueville treats as mere instrument of social bonding. Why is ambition so widespread in a modern democracy? Equality of conditions. Why is there so little great ambition? Competition. Why does great ambition, when freed from constraints, tend to be so wild and unbounded? The absence of gentlemanly customs. Democracy presents a huge multitude of individuals seeking to get out of their original condition. What we call equality of opportunity makes wealth, honor, and fortune open to all. All are filled with desire and inspired with hope. Still, the sea of ambition eclipses grand ambition. However devoured by the desire to acquire goods, reputation, and power, few Americans, he says, envision these things on a grand scale. The problem, it is such a struggle to rise. Resources for all, yes, but extensive resources for any? No. Few have great riches, and this leads ambition to focus on everyday necessities of life. But what especially constrains hope and ambition is all the competition. So much energy, so much time goes into each little advance. Violent efforts, I quote him, long years are needed. The incessant work, the long hours, the steady climb up this ladder, then another ladder, and another. Youth is lost, Tocqueville says, and imagination is extinguished. Ambition shrinks. Moreover, laws and customs exacerbate the effort. The democratic citizen hates privilege. He's embarrassed about privileging. I apologize for using that as a verb, all right? There I am. Is embarrassed about privileging one over another on grounds of merit and character. Accordingly, all men and women must pass through the same filter. And thus, even when the able finally arrive at power and fortune, they have lost the taste for extraordinary things. Nor are the rich, for the most part, exceptions, Tocqueville says, as one might think. For the man who raises himself by a long struggle contracts habits of prudence and restraint that limit his horizon, and very often limit his children's horizon too. Tocqueville concludes, in democratic circumstance, the moralist might better praise the vices audacity and pride than the virtue humility. Counter the Americans' tendency so to despise themselves as to be content with small jobs and ambitions. An implication is something about everyday democratic life is despicable. The retreat from great ambition is a retreat in quality as well as extent, from ambition very high as well as vast. This shows itself in the American version of honor, which Tocqueville discusses in Volume 2's second longest chapter. Yes, an American honors virtues, but they tend to be those that promote trade, industry, and the conquest of their vast continent. What he calls honorable ambition, the Europeans would call cupidity. The object of honor is lowered. Moreover, the very hold or force of honor weakens. When in democracy all citizens are confused in the crowd and constantly act on each other, public opinion has no hold. Honor is therefore less imperious and less pressing there. Authoritative casts are absent. Instead, there is a corresponding humanitarian erasure of lines between people. One has to break down lines. How often does one hear that? Tocqueville speculates on humanitarian democracy's inherent tendencies. If one could suppose that all races and countries would have the same interests and needs, on his argument, honor would have little or no place. The general needs of humanity that conscience reveals would be the common measure. Honor would disappear with the dissimilarities and inequalities of man. Does this humanitarian culmination mean the disappearance, too, of honorable men and women, of gentlemen and ladies? Fifth and last topic. Fears and doubts. Tocqueville, the sad liberal. The politic Tocqueville, practical, not a man who worried about getting ensconced in abstract theories. The politic Tocqueville surely doubted that any such complete equalizing of humanity would come about. But he nevertheless worried about the general direction and the likely effects, even without such a culmination. What he most feared from the Democrats' preoccupation with basic needs, basic human needs, can be summed up in three familiar topics, which I'll expound on a bit more. Industrial aristocracy, the all-providing administrative state, and finally, the slighting of supra-social and supra-political higher forms of greatness. I'm going to conclude with thoughts on this last one, especially, for that involves the root of the problem. That conscience, as even Tocqueville understands it, is limited to the ordinary, even to the barely human, the general needs of humanity, that is, the necessities of bodily living. To begin with, and this is a question, I think, for how this happens on the basis of equality of conditions. Democracy expands the hold of the industrialist empire builder over the ever more controlled, ever more narrowly specialized laborer. Tocqueville worries about the mind, what industry does to the thoughtfulness of ordinary people. With division of labor, the industrialist gains vast views and ambitions. Think of our multinational corporations. The workers get an ever smaller role and soul. The new baron of industry is a kind of twisted greatness. His is one of the hardest aristocracies ever, says Tocqueville. Contriving comprehensive schemes, he nevertheless lacks the old aristocracy's comprehensive responsibility for his laborer. Meanwhile, the industrial worker does nothing but, say, make pinheads. The man in him is degraded as the worker is perfected. Industrial science constantly lowers workers and elevates masters. And Tocqueville worries about this, the great problem of the late 19th century in this country, and always a problem to be dealt with. But Tocqueville fears more the centralized and humane administrative or service state. Since industrial aristocracy, is alien to the democratic element it swims in, democracy can attack it and modify it. T.R., Woodrow Wilson, the New Deal. But the administrative state appears but a servant of democracy. It delivers the goods, not merely producing them. And it is not only humane in effect, but also insidiously representative in form. From Tocqueville's point of view, the representative state, in fact, has a kind of dangerous authority by virtue of it being precisely by being representative. You think it's yours, my government, my representative, and such. But the result is that this provision for human needs or the basic necessities takes priority over many other important things, he thinks. Also, this state has the iron of sovereignty behind it. That is, the modern sovereign state is a central administration superior to intermediate powers in insistence on comprehensive and uniform control. What is the likely eventual result? On the one hand, Tocqueville's words, an innumerable crowd of like and equal men revolve on themselves without repose, procuring the small and vulgar pleasures with which they fill their souls. On the other hand, an immense tutelary power, which alone would assure their enjoyments and watch over their fate. Tocqueville says this is a soft despotism. It's not that it's a violent oppressor. It rather takes care of people in all kinds of ways and gradually narrows their own abilities. Might it not take away from them the trouble of thinking and the pain of living? Tocqueville sees the possibility of not tyranny in the usual sense, but of an unprecedented degradation in soft despotism. That is, sovereigns who reduce their nation to, quote, a herd of timid and industrious animals, of which the government is the shepherd. Now, Tocqueville is no simple-minded conservative. It could be worse. Such a state in popular form is better, infinitely preferable to a dictatorship or aristocracy, a modern dictatorship or aristocracy. Better a government checked by popular consent and supervised by a really elected and independent legislature than government by Napoleon III, which he viewed the beginning of that, who represented, in a way, many of the things he was worried about, or by some new kind of military or other oligarchy. Tocqueville appreciates the grave difference. Nevertheless, his principal problem remains. Popular oversight will not prevent the people from losing little by little the faculty of thinking, feeling, and acting by themselves, and thus from gradually falling below the level of humanity. For the problem is popular taste, together with certain aggravating theories that prescribe ever more division of labor and ever more effective public administration. He worried about the so-called science of public administration and its focus upon efficacy. So the importance of his biggest recommendation, his art of being free through decentralized administration, elective local democracy, the fostering of religion, the creed of rights, and so forth. Nevertheless, Tocqueville retains certain grave doubts. Partly, he doubts the success of his prescriptions. Democratic materialism is powerful enough to undermine and overwhelm would-be barriers. Take the case of religion, which Tocqueville goes so far as to he calls religion, quote, the first of America's political institutions, unquote. How could society not perish, he says, if while the political bond is relaxed, the moral bond were not tightened? And what makes a people master of itself if it has not submitted to God. His lifelong effort, he later said, was to blend liberalism with the elevating influence of religion. But in Democracy in America, even there, he quietly notes that religion is, quote, declining. But there is a deeper reason for his doubt, I think, a doubt about democracy, even if successful. For Tocqueville was drawn to those of extraordinary tastes and talents, and he always esteemed the very great, the very rich, very learned as a young man, rather than the small, the poor, the ignorant. But then, as I've said before, he considered matters from a more comprehensive point of view, God's point of view. It is natural to believe that what satisfies, capital H, him, is the greatest well-being of all. What seems to be decadence is therefore progress. The problem shows itself. He also calls common well-being ordinary, low, uncaring of genuine greatness. Ordinary Americans may not hate and fear the elevated classes and great talents, but they feel little goodwill. They have little taste for them. They keep them out of power. Ordinary taste will slight superior taste, including that for the most sublime faculties. Tocqueville's famous example of sublime taste is the search for truth of the French philosopher-theologian Pascal. Such a passion, so rare and fruitful, cannot easily appear, he seemed to think, in democratic societies, so eager for present material enjoyments, so preoccupied with changing their fortune or increasing it. I'm going to conclude with a question out of season. Why Tocqueville's insistence that only democracy is just and aristocracy, at least the version that encourages greatness, is not? You see, it's a question out of season. For if genuine greatness is superior, even befitting the most sublime faculties, does it not deserve a place in a republic? Or at least deserve a high place in our esteem, at least for suitable souls? In Democracy in America, Tocqueville, in fact, urges many steps to elevate our democratic arrangements, including smaller things, such as fostering the ancient classics in our best universities, and larger things, such as encouraging worship of God. But my question is this: why does Tocqueville not include the claim of genuine greatness among just claims, claims that a just order, or at least a fair observer, ought to keep in mind and honor? There are two reasons or premises, I think, for this: his democratic conscience and his tacit skepticism. First and most obvious, conscience holds that equal freedom is right. We're going to abbreviate a little bit. Democracy is on the side of the general needs of humanity. But why should this exclude completely other claims? Granting that everybody universally should have basic rights, might not genuinely superior people also have their deserts? A superior respect. Did not Washington deserve superior authority and honor, both as useful to society and as admirably superior? Men of the quality of Jefferson and Hamilton thought Washington superior and deserving of his superior post. In the background of Tocqueville's thinking, however, is another argument, a skepticism about judgments of greatness. The most obvious sign is his historical account. Greatness is obsolete as a standard. But something past, of course, might be superior. Think of the way historians rank Washington or Lincoln superior to all the more contemporary presidents. Something old might be better. Yes? The telling premise of Tocqueville's skepticism is not historical, but philosophic. The taste for greatness at times seems but a taste, not an insight. The arbitrariness of the taste for greatness is at the deeper premise of Tocqueville's skepticism. I could discuss at length, and would like to discuss at length, but won't, his chapter on honor, which shows a kind of skepticism about honorableness. You think of Washington as a very honorable man who would not stoop. He looked up to the high and held himself to a high standard. Tocqueville basically gets rid of that understanding of honor and replaces it with an understanding of honor as a bond of society. But I won't discuss that. This charge of skepticism, which, by the way, builds on a quick remark of Mansfield in his introduction. This charge of skepticism, however, seems at odds with Tocqueville's general reliance on greatness, even in characterizing democracy. I think it's truer to say that he understands greatness finally in light of what he calls human freedom, the source of all moral greatness. That is, he understands moral greatness not in terms of moral virtue, but a freedom of a moral kind, moral freedom, an independence of reason from interest and a control over interest. In turn, he conceives this moral freedom in light of the equal freedom of man, pointing to a society governing itself, that is, submitting to law, government, and a head of state reasonably, that is, by a reasoned and tranquil sentiment. So, virtue is equivalent to the idea of rights, and in that deep way, he in fact shows at once a kind of skepticism about virtue as we understand it, including honorableness, and at the same time defends a certain kind of greatness which emphasizes the control of reason over interest, and that evidently can be brought about with the help of religion. Nevertheless, I want to close by reminding of Tocqueville's practical accomplishments, not about these theoretical depths. His masterwork shows him both friend of democratic equality and admirer of human quality, and his counsel to modern Democrats, us, benefits from both. But he could bring this comprehensive prudence to bear only by distancing himself from both the liberal and conservative theorizing of his time. That's why his practical outlook is so fruitful for those of you who read his book. For that theorizing could have led either to principled zealotry, think of the socialism, and the Marxist socialism, and also the French very radical liberals. That theorizing could have led either to principled zealotry, which he feared, or some pseudoscience of necessary historical development, Marx, something of that kind, which he thought inhumane and cowardly. Instead, Tocqueville could judge practice prudently, practically, and generously, taking into account both the equal rights of all and within that priority, the just deserts of those who deserve more. Thank you. Questions? Objections? I persuaded you all. Helen.
You mentioned at one point that Tocqueville would prefer soft despotism to aristocracy. Or maybe I misheard you. Do you think that he would prefer this kind of soft despotism to aristocracy? And if so, why? Is that because you would think he would have so much allegiance to the beauty of the principle of equality and the thought that it's more just? Or what?
Two reasons. One is that. Two reasons. The most important is the age of aristocracy is past. And there's a political argument underlying that. There's so much equality that we cannot restore the kind of aristocracy that would be a French or English aristocracy of the past. The social conditions have changed. That relies on something I haven't talked about, but will emphasize, which is what has determined things is our social state, equality of conditions. That's changed. And I think also he does believe in the superior justice of democracy, and therefore that would come to mind. But maybe the crucial reason is the first one. Yes.
I understand did Tocqueville see, did he provide any guidance for avoiding despotism from above, from the aristocratic class, rather than?
Did he provide any guidance in providing against a despotism from above, from the aristocratic class? First of all, he thought the era. First of all, he thought that the era of aristocracy was past. Or I'm repeating myself. The democratic condition of society would prevent an aristocracy, a traditional aristocracy, from coming to mind. If you're talking about a new kind of aristocracy, of military men, or of wealthy, of rich capitalists, or he really provided against that, and his whole emphasis upon encouraging people to participate in politics, participatory democracy, his emphasis upon teaching people to think independently and be enlightened. So our schools, our newspapers, those things help to prick up a people to take care of their own freedom. And all his recommendations of powerful intermediary groups. So in the old days, the Elks, the PTA, the many associations for causes or NGOs and such, those he regarded as politically very important in building up society, free society. Yes.
Puzzled by something. He was here in this country in the 1830s. He wrote this in the 1840s.
He wrote it in the 1830s.
He wrote it in the 1830s. That seems to make me more puzzled. Because he talks about this industrialization of America. Now, I don't perceive our history that way. I perceive our history as being largely agricultural until the Civil War. And at that point, I don't think that there was a whole lot of this menace that he's talking about. Many countries outside of, say, England and France and Germany, where you had that kind of growing industrialization and the London proletariat. He starts off by actually, in that one section there, he's talking about the notion of how history is going to play out in section 3. That's kind of the beginning in one way, which makes sense because he's sitting there reading all these people, and he's right in that little slot between Hegel and Marx. He's against the kind of follow-on things Marx is going to have in terms of where is this going. He doesn't see that same thing going out. But I don't see him picking up the real nature of this country at that time. I think that he's imposing on us a lot of what was happening in Europe. And he's also, in some ways, I get the notion that it's a little bit of like gossiping. He's sitting there in a nice home someplace in New York City, or some other Boston, or some other place like that, talking with the province at that time, and their concerns about what was happening. But the real frontier of America, we hadn't even gone to California.
It's Tocqueville's talk of industrialism artificial, or at least not appropriate for the United States, however it might apply in France, Britain, or Germany. First of all, Tocqueville is talking about democracy as such, as well as about America. He's talking about democracy in America, but he's seeing it as I'll be a little more cautious, a Western worldwide phenomenon. It's been a real mess in France. It hasn't succeeded very well elsewhere at the time he's writing. It didn't succeed very well in 1848 across Europe. But the Americans have succeeded. So he is also talking about democracy generally and its tendencies. He certainly was aware of what was going on in Manchester. But even in this country, say someone like James Madison wrote to his friends really worried about the development of something like Manchester and how in fact, the country would deal with this and the problems in this country from that development. So you're absolutely right, Tocqueville is informed. I wouldn't use Hegel as any kind of model for him. He had such doubts about systematizers and relying upon history. And he also did not see as Hegel that things were going to work out just fine, that the rational was going to become actual. That required human effort and democratic effort in a way that Hegel does not suggest. Yeah.
We have time for one more question.
I think I agree with your concluding remarks on why Tocqueville praises greatness, that in some way it's subordinate to his concern for liberty, just in the sense that individuals who are concerned with greatness are called forth towards great actions, and that releases them in some way from being taken care of by the nanny state, for lack of a better term. My concern is, I wonder if you think that that's an adequate account of greatness. I wonder if you think that that's a great account of greatness. And let me put it in this sense. We can compare Tocqueville on greatness to two other understandings of greatness, one that comes out of Pericles' funeral oration, Thucydides, and the other that comes out of Nietzsche, who I think is a much more consistent and probably more impressive aristocrat than Tocqueville is. With Pericles, you get the idea that the greatness of Athens consists in its immortality, the promise of immortality that dying for Athens on the battlefield promises the individual. In Nietzsche, you get the idea that greatness consists in suffering and in overcoming. So in a way, it shows one's own inner strength, one's will to power, and that's what truly impresses us. That is greatness. Tocqueville is too much of a liberal for me in that respect, because he takes this concept of greatness and he subordinates it to the condition of greatness, which is freedom. And that seems to be wholly inadequate. And I wonder if you agree with that.
Yes and no. And I want you to press me if I don't answer your complicated question well. Let's start with the most obvious. He would hate Nietzsche. That doesn't mean Nietzsche's wrong, but Tocqueville has reasons. And it's the reduction of greatness to brutishness, or the inability to separate the two adequately, that would really trouble Tocqueville. That's a no part. The broad argument of your question seems to be correct. And I'll put it in my own way. When, in a passage I didn't quote in the talk, Tocqueville says that from the general needs of humanity come the moral laws, the general moral laws, which we must abide. That means, on the one hand, he believes liberty is reason controlling interest, and on the other hand, he argues that our moral reason is derivative from interest, from our human needs. In that way, the influence of Hobbes is still with him. So the great modern teachings which have had such influence. So there's a problem in his deriving greatness from human freedom, from moral freedom. There's a problem in his notion of moral freedom. From that point of view, but let me back off and repeat my conclusion, which is whatever the deep difficulties in Tocqueville's deep formulations, he remained at a practical level, taking account of practical understandings of greatness, like Washington, or like those great figures, political figures, or like Pascal, and could talk about such things in a way that's really instructive to us people, and maybe most instructive to all of us with our concern for, with our political and social concern for equal rights and for a liberal order.
Well, join me in thanking